Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to the July board meeting. I'm trying to remember which month we're in, but it's July, definitely July, so welcome. Particularly welcome to Professor Edward Baker, the Chief Inspector of Hospitals Designate. Welcome, Ted. It's great to have you here. I'll welcome other guests in a moment. We have apologies of absence from Lewis Appleby and Eileen Milner. Are there any declarations of interest that anybody needs to make? Okay, that's good. Minutes of the June meeting, are they a true and accurate record of everything we discussed? Okay, good, thank you, that's agreed. Action log, there are 3 items on the action log. One is ongoing, the presentation by Paul Elliott on the mental health reports and improving the timeliness of inspection reports. That's ongoing and will come back. And then there are 2 other actions which are both, David, in your report when we get to it. So I think that covers everything in the action log. Is there anything else arising anybody wanted to raise? Okay, good. So then we can move to the first sort of substantive item, which is to talk about the National Guardian, the freedom to speak up. So I don't know, can I welcome, first of all, Henrietta Hughes, Mary Cridge and Nick Harper. I don't know if you want to come to where there are microphones. I think, as everybody knows, Dr. Henrietta Hughes is the National Guardian, and you're probably going to kick this off. Well, actually, I don't know. Are you going to kick it off, or are we going to go to our other guest, Dr. Nick Harper? Are you going to? Who's going to start? We should have rehearsed this, shouldn't we? Especially since we all had dinner last night. We could have planned this a little better. Would it be sensible, Nick, for you to start? And that sets a really, really nice scene. But before you do, can I also just welcome Mary Cridge, who will also be speaking later. Mary has a variety of roles within CQC, but one of them is you are our Speak Up champion, Free to Speak Up champion. So you'll be speaking about what we're doing as an organisation. But Nick, you have a great story, so why don't we hand over to you to set the scene, as it were. You need to press the button so that we can all hear you, and so can everybody around the world listening in.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Nick Harper. I'm a consultant anaesthetist at Blackpool Victoria Hospital, where I've worked for nearly 20 years. I'm the Deputy Medical Director and the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, and I am a whistleblower within the NHS. I was compelled to speak up within my first year as a consultant in 1998. And whilst 20 years ago seems like a long time, I think my experience is still valuable today. So on the 5th of January 1998, just a few weeks into my first consultant post, I worked with a particular surgeon for the 6th occasion. We had a patient on the operating list undergoing major surgery, but routine. Unfortunately for this particular patient, the surgery was far from routine. The patient suffered catastrophic hemorrhage, losing 20 litres of blood uncontrollably. The performance and conduct of the surgeon was unlike anything I had encountered in an operating theatre previously. Eventually, after a massive transfusion of blood and blood products, the surgery had to be abandoned, and I transferred the patient to the intensive care unit, where sadly they died a few hours later. That evening at home, I reflected. My patient has died barely 12 hours after coming into hospital for routine surgery. I was completely shattered. The patient that morning had been anxious, and I reassured them, said that this was routine surgery and I'm going to keep you safe. And now that patient's gone. I felt incredibly guilty, but I couldn't think of anything more I could have done. There was a feeling that I'd let the family down, and that I'd let the patient down. I'd never encountered a patient not surviving surgery under circumstances such as those. My immediate thought was, I need to talk to someone about this, but who can I talk to? We don't really talk about this kind of case in the NHS. Ultimately, I had to believe that this was a one-off case, and I continued to work with the surgeon. but I made a promise to myself that should any other patient come to significant harm, despite my best efforts, I would have to take some form of action. Over the next 11 months working with the surgeon, I developed a significant number of concerns about his practice. Something happened almost every week, but I was managing to keep my patients from significant harm since that first tragedy. In October 1998, I met with the medical director, I raised my concerns, and I became a whistleblower. The medical director decided that it would be appropriate to perform a surgical review of the cases I had raised. But unfortunately, in December 1998, before that review was complete, there was another patient safety incident in which a patient came to harm, and that led to me refusing to work with the surgeon. The following day, the entire anaesthetic department withdrew support for the surgeon until the review was complete. What followed over the next 7 years were multiple parallel and overlapping processes of investigation and procedure. These processes started locally, and more cases and concerns came to light as the investigation began. Multiple members of staff were involved and multiple patients. After 2 years, the GMC became involved in an investigation leading to GMC processes, and then the police started a criminal investigation leading to a manslaughter trial. In September 2004, the surgeon pleaded guilty to the charge of manslaughter on a patient he had operated on in 1995, 2 years before I'd started as a consultant. And in December 2005, he returned to the GMC and was erased from the medical register. Throughout this entire period of time, I continued to work as a full-time consultant anaesthetist, whilst simultaneously being heavily involved in each of the arms of the investigations that were ongoing. I had to appear as a witness at a GMC hearing, which is an experience I'd be glad to never repeat. As I've stated, there were multiple more members of staff as witnesses than just myself. And over this time period, over the years, I became the sort of unofficial support service to many members of staff who would come to me seeking advice. I wasn't really an expert, and I don't feel that I was in a position to offer them any formal advice, but I did what I could do, which was to listen to their concerns, to offer them what support and reassurance I could. There were inevitably personal consequences for me as a result of the action I took. For some time, a significant proportion of the consultant body kept me distant and isolated. I was treated with suspicion. If I was in a room of consultants, I was aware that they were talking about me, but they weren't talking to me. Newly appointed consultant colleagues were advised not to trust me and warned to stay away. I suffered attempts to intimidate me, and on a number of occasions I was publicly verbally challenged. My wife and my family were subject to unfair treatment in the community, and when they were endangered, I was forced to report it to the police. I did have some supporters, but they were few in number, and their support was quiet and in private. And even then, their support often wavered as a result of personal friendships and peer pressures. For the first few years, I received very little support from my organisation, although the fact that they started the surgical review was demonstration that my concerns were taken seriously. But on a personal level, I was expected to cope. I once, at a moment where I was feeling particularly isolated, made contact with the confidential helpline for doctors. They made it very clear to me that they would not support a whistleblower. I was able to make contact with Public Concern at Work, the whistleblowing charity, where an advisor called Anna Myers was a tremendous support and help. She listened to my story and advised me as an expert that I had done the right thing. And I was truly able to discuss my situation with Anna in a way that I dare not even discuss it with my closest friends for fear of judgment. Anna was also able to give me a bit of a reality check, in that she advised me that expecting my organisation to be grateful for the concern I'd raised was a bit unrealistic. I had raised a difficult subject that no organisation would be glad to handle, and in that sense she gave me that sort of advice you might expect from a close friend. Ultimately, my concerns were justified. the surgeon was judged to have committed multiple acts of serious professional misconduct and by his own admission was guilty of manslaughter. I persevered throughout this period and decided I had to try and turn my experience into something positive. I began to work first locally, then nationally with public concern at work. I worked with the hospital to develop the first raising concerns policy, and within the department we developed a system for recording incidents in the operating theatre and investigating and following them up. In July 2005 I was actually appointed to clinical director of the department, which for me was an indication that the organisation had faith and confidence in me. A year later I was appointed deputy medical director, and a year after that the director of infection prevention and control. It seemed clear to me that locally at least my action was not being held against me, which is something for which my employer deserves some credit given the history of individuals such as me within the NHS. In 2012 I stepped back from medical management and was almost immediately elected to sit on the local negotiating committee by my consultant colleagues. The body that had at one time pushed me aside had now elected me to represent them, and for me it felt like the circle of healing was complete. In 2015 I once again became the Deputy Medical Director, and in 2016 the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. If there had been a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian in 1998, I would definitely have spoken to them, and I would probably have spoken to them before I did to the Medical Director. I would have appreciated the fact I could have a discussion in which my confidence was assured, with someone that could give me advice and would stand by my side and support me through whatever processes would ensue. I would have understood that that individual would protect me from the attempts at intimidation and harassment, and I would also have appreciated the fact that the Guardian could hold the organisation to account for ensuring there was adequate investigation and that any lessons that needed to be learned or actions that needed to be taken would be taken by the organisation, and that this was their issue and not mine. The Guardian would also have been my expert friend, my Anna Myers, necessarily delivering a dose of reality if that was what I needed. The Freedom to Speak Up Guardian should be at the vanguard of cultural change. The raising of concerns, investigating, managing and implementing change should simply be the way we work. That way we can manage concerns when they're small issues, prevent them becoming large issues that become almost unmanageable. When speaking up becomes business as usual, I would hope that the role of Guardian almost becomes redundant and the need for whistleblowers disappears. Although I would have to say I have always maintained as a whistleblower, I'm not the issue. The issue was the fact there was a whistle that needed to be blown. Thank you for listening.
Nick, we could, I suspect, spend the rest of the morning discussing all kinds of things that come out of your experience. I think all I want to do at this moment is say two things. One, to congratulate you on the journey you went through and sticking the course, because there was a real public interest in you doing that at obviously a huge personal cost to you and your family. But secondly, I mean, I can't imagine a more graphic way of setting out why this is such an important issue, and the role of the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians is so important. So thank you for doing that. So without giving any of my colleagues the chance to hijack the rest of the morning by talking to you, let's go straight to Henrietta. I mean, I think you couldn't have had a better introduction as to why what you're doing is so important. So why don't you go into your presentation and updating the board on where you've got to.
Well, thank you very much. And I think what we've heard from Nick just really exemplifies the values that we need in the NHS in terms of, courage and an inspirational story, but also, the amazing way that Nick has used his experiences for a positive outcome by being able to share this so that others can learn from it. I think what I've really learned over the last year since I was appointed into the role of National Guardian, and I started in October, was that speaking up well is part of the story, but listening well is the most important thing, that concerns, rather than being pushed up from the ground, are drawn up instead from the leadership. I've a paper for this meeting, and I can just give a very brief overview of what we've done so far over the last year, but also very happy to take any questions as well. So, for me, the establishment of and the embedding of the principles from Sir Robert Francis's report is the sort of first step in this, I would say. And now we've got a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian in every trust in the country. And I'm really talking about secondary care here, because NHS England are responsible for primary care. And we've got nearly 500 people who hold the title either Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, Ambassador or Champion across the country. And I think that's a really positive thing. And in fact, when I spoke to one of the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, she said, we've got 3,000 people working in this trust. I'd like all of them to be Freedom to Speak Up ambassadors. So I do think there's something about the public movement, the social kind of movement here, rather than this being something which is an elite or exclusive activity. The other thing that I was going to say is that we've got guardians who reflect a wide range of different job roles within the organisations, including nurses, doctors, therapists, chaplains, facilities managers, company secretaries, and some board members and some non-executive directors. And by going out and visiting the trusts and actually seeing how those roles are being implemented, we've learned a huge amount, which we've then shared across the country with other guardians. The guardians, some of them are on their own in the post, and that can be quite lonely. So we've brought together the guardians into 10 regions. That was one of the first things that we did, so that they can get the support from each other, the buddying, the mentoring, as some people coming into post, not having to reinvent the wheel, that they can actually learn from each other's experience. And we're providing guidance in terms of recording of information, how to report to the board, because for some people, they've never even gone into the executive part of the hospital before, so it's really quite a big learning curve for them. The other thing I was going to say is that Guardians work in a way that I've come across no other tribe in the NHS that does this, because they are so happy to share their information, to learn from each other. Organisational boundaries are extremely porous, and I do think there's something that could really be learnt from that in the way that organisations work together, coming together into sort of STP footprints, but also trusts, for example, the ambulance trusts and the community mental health trusts have recognised that they have something in common and that they have formed their own national networks as well. We've been recording some information about how many people have spoken up, and to the end of March there were 2,850 members of staff who'd come to speak to a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, and approximately 25% of those were patient safety issues. We're now starting a quarterly recording process where we'll be getting a bit more granular detail, and we'll be publishing that on our web pages. The other thing that we've done recently is a survey of Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, and we will be publishing the results of that. But the early indications do appear that there's a correlation between the support that Guardians feel that they get from their senior leadership teams and CQC ratings. So we're looking at that in more detail, but I think that's something that could be quite interesting. Clearly, the support that we get from the arm's length bodies and other bodies around the NHS is absolutely phenomenal. So, as you're aware, obviously, that it's part of the well-led inspection, and we're seeing some of the early outcomes from that. But we're also working in partnership with NHS Improvement, with NHS England in primary care, with professional regulators, with professional bodies, associations, but also with all the other campaigns that exist, so that we can then develop a good practice guide for speaking up, using all of the information that other bodies have put together for Freedom to Speak Up. The other thing that I was going to say is that this is we're not resting on this. I see this as very much first step. And what I'm going to be interested in to see is, once trusts have embedded the Francis principles, then it's saying, well, what's the next challenge? What are the next steps to get to the point where speaking up is business as usual? So hopefully over the next few months, as we start seeing the case reviews coming into place, and also professional bodies and other organisations really pulling their weight in this, we'll really start seeing where this can lead us to.
Thank you. Why don't, before I open it up for discussion, Mary, why don't you just update us on what you've been doing within CQC?
Thank you. So I was appointed to the role after competition, and it's additional to my day job, as it were. So since appointment, I have been gathering my support networks around me and working closely with colleagues in HR and engagement. And I've formed what I'm calling a reference group made up of from people across CQC, and including the chairs of our equality networks and our staff forum. And using this group to sort of guide the work, putting together, to hold me to account for the work plan and to support it more generally. I am recruiting Speak Up ambassadors who will be provided with some training, be entirely voluntary, to work really on the model of our Dignity at Work advisors, who are people that we have similarly trained to support people when they need help, if they feel they are being treated unfairly or bullied and so on. So the idea is that the ambassadors will support people and will encourage them and signpost them. So this is about using some of our signposting people into some of our existing processes. And I think it's an interesting message that, yes, I am the Speak Up Guardian and please come to me, but you don't need a guardian to speak up. We need to get into the habit of doing it as a matter of course, as Henrietta has said. I've been supported and guided by Henrietta and her staff, and I've also been working with one of the associate professors from Ashridge, Professor Megan Rees, who's recently published some research around capacity to speak up. And her research has covered 60 chairs and chief executives from various walks of life, including the NHS, the military, media and banking. And the key lessons from that are that, of course, we need the right processes in place and good policies, and then to work well within those. But what really matters is the habit and it becoming a way of life to speak up. The research has shown, which we probably were already aware of, but it makes it very clear, that those in positions of leadership and authority generally have a vastly inflated idea of how easy it is to speak up to them, share information with people who have power over one's career. So I think it is a bit of a call to arms from me for not just to the people here present, but everyone within CQC, to actively consider that power imbalance in all interactions with people and to actively work on being as open as possible. Speaking up well is really important, and Henrietta has said listening well, that's just as important, otherwise it's all going to be lost. I will be bringing to boards in future a report of my activity and identifying themes and trends and lessons from that. So this is the start of an ongoing engagement and conversation. Speak Up in the CQC land will encompass everything from the sort of concern about fraud activity at that end of the scale. But this is Speak Up for everybody, as much for those working in adult social care, the colleagues who support us from strategy and intelligence. I am concerned that this isn't branded as a hospital activity within the organisation. So it is for everybody. It will be a key part of our well-being strategy going forward. And but as I say, I'm going to need us all to be in on this and all to actively practice it day in, day out. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks very much for what you're doing and having volunteered to do it, as you say, in addition to your day job, well, which isn't a small one either, so thank you again. Let me open this up to the board. Robert.
Firstly, can I thank Dr. Harper and Henrietta and Mary for what they've said. And it brings home to me many of the stories I heard during the review I did. And it emphasises, in my view, the critical importance of this work. I can actually think, is no exaggeration, and no other more important feature for measuring the health of an organisation and its effectiveness in the service it provides than the way in which people who have concerns are treated, and the way in which, just if not more importantly, the concerns they raise are treated. I'm really glad to see that this learning is being incorporated into the work we do, not only supporting our own staff but also in the work of inspections. And I'm pleased to hear that Henrietta is getting the support she needs from organisations across the piece. But can I just ask a question, which is of Henrietta, is to whether she feels there's more support we as a board could give her, or what she would be looking for, and also the other bodies who are party to this. There is a governance process. I currently chair a small accountability and liaison board which represents all the bodies that sponsor the office. And the event we have here today, it seems to me, is a very important part of the process, but and in many ways. But Henrietta, what would you recommend to us and boards, not let's put it collectively, going forward in relation to our relationship with your office?
Thank you very much. My experience to date is that when I come and ask for something, the response I get is, yes, absolutely, but we could also do this, this and this. So if that carries on, then I'll continue to be very pleased. I think there's something really important about the support that my office gets, and that's about the visible leadership, the visible demonstration, and I'm absolutely delighted that so many people around the table are wearing a visible demonstration of that. And I think it's really important for all staff who are working in trusts, in commissioning, in regulation, and in all of the professional bodies to see that they have a really key part to play in this. And any organisation that doesn't yet see that they have a part to play in it is just because I haven't identified and persuaded them of that fact yet. But as I said, I haven't had a situation where I feel blocked. And I think that's a really encouraging thing for me.
Help with any data that you need from Local Health Watch. A couple of comments. One is, can we please not turn Guardians into an acronym? FTSUGS is the most awful word. Let's not lose it in that way. That would be terrible. I think that what you're doing is sending a wonderfully strong signal. There are, as we are here, obviously, to bash ourselves up over this, and quite rightly, because this has gone on far too long and must stop now, one feels. A couple of gleams that I found on my travels. One, when we went up, the whole CQC board went up to Newcastle. We visited the emergency hospital up there, and they said that they recruit. When they recruit, they obviously they're looking for skills in their consultants, but they recruit first for values. So they recruit for values and then for skills. And it said that they did find themselves turning away one or two people that had the skills but didn't have the right values. So I thought that was a really interesting, and I haven't heard it before. And the other one, when I was up in the northwest the other day, we at Health Watch sometimes hear, we often hear from the public, we sometimes hear from members of staff, and likewise for CQC, I know, on inspections. But on this occasion, when we fed back to the hospital the issue and they moved quickly to do something about it, they also said, we are mortified. What have we done that people feel that they have to come out to you outside? What have we done wrong? So they moved to improve their systems. So I think there's movement out there.
Good. Andrea?
Sorry. Thank you, and thank you, repeat Robert's thanks to Nick and to Henrietta and Mary for the presentations that they've made, and particularly to Nick for sharing his story. And I just wanted to say that obviously the focus of this conversation has been on what's happening in the NHS. Robert's review was focused on what was happening in the NHS, and therefore the recommendations came to support Freedom to Speak Up Guardians within health service organisations, and we've not really focused on adult social care to quite the same extent. was really pleased to hear Mary say, you know, this is something that actually extends beyond just the hospital's bit of CQC and into other areas. But I think it also extends beyond, not just within CQC, but in the services that we're regulating. And I think the issue of whistleblowing is just as important in adult social care, and in some ways even more difficult for people because of the very small nature of some of these services and the difficulty for people to feel confident in doing that, and particularly if they're really kind of trying to go against a prevailing culture which does not encourage that. So I think it's very important that the way that we do our inspections and we focus on this in the questions that we ask when we ask whether a service is well led is how supported are staff to raise concerns, are they responded to appropriately, and does the management and the provider ensure that that is available for them. So I think, you know, whilst we've generally kind of talked about it from a health service perspective, I think it's worthwhile for this board to recognise and acknowledge that this is a really important issue in adult social care as well.
And I think just to add to what you said, it's not just about how well organisations respond to staff when they raise concerns, but how easy is it to raise those concerns, and particularly, as you say, in small organisations, but actually across the piece. Yeah, excellent. Ted.
Thank you. Big thank you to Nick for sharing his story with us. The culture he describes the event he described may have started 20 years ago, but the culture he describes we still find on our inspections recently. So this is still very much a problem out there in the healthcare system, in our hospitals, and I think it's important for us to recognise the extent of the cultural change that we're trying to drive. So we're fully behind Henrietta and her work. She describes it as a social movement, and very much a social movement we want to join and support. I think something that often goes unremarked, which has come over very strongly to me in our inspections, is that often the unsung heroes in our inspections are the many staff who raise concerns with us directly, either call themselves whistleblowers, but often not, just raising concerns with us. And I think one of the strongest voices in our reports are the voices of staff who are longing to be heard. And Mary's point about people in power in organisations underestimating how difficult it is to raise concerns, I think is a very important one. And I think many of the senior people in organisations, when we report back these concerns, don't understand why they haven't heard them themselves. And I think that is a big learning lesson for us all, that actually it is quite difficult for staff to raise these concerns. And we shouldn't take it for granted they're going to unless we go out and give them the opportunity to do so.
Great. I mean, being a glass half full person, I'm very encouraged by this morning. So, I mean, you can be discouraged because the issues haven't gone away and haven't all been addressed. But I'm encouraged because I think a lot of progress has been made. And as you rightly said, Nick, if only we'd had a guardian, if one had been available to you, your personal story might have been a lot easier. So I'm encouraged. So thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for coming, Nick. Thank you, the other two of you, for what you're doing. And we will see you again at the board. We will look forward to even greater progress when you're next here. If you want to stay for the rest of the meeting, please do. But I know, Henrietta, at least you need to rush off to something else, but you're welcome anyway. So with that, David, can we move on to your report, please?
Thank you. So this is largely an update report. There's a performance report which follows this, which I'll present with some help from other colleagues. So I'll do this at some speed in relation to the updates. So first item I just want to draw attention to, Andrea led the publication of the end of programme report on adult social care on the 6th of July, and this is our first meeting since that report was published, and just to mark the publication of that report and the impact that it's had, I think, in terms of catalysing the debate again about the quality of adult social care and its importance. And I think in an urgent question drew some commitments from government in relation to the ambition to bring forward the Green Paper perhaps later this year. So important. We've previously reported on digital and the progress, and you've got an update report here. The purpose of this report is to give the board, particularly non-executive directors, just a sense of momentum that there is work going on. We'll bring a fuller report back to the September board, which will continue the work on prioritisation and have more detail in the investments that we need to make in relation to this. But the progress on the adult social care provider information return, Jura, I hope this is not too out of date for you, going back to your early comments. But that progresses well. We're assisted by PA Consulting. Just absolute coincidence. I spent about an hour down there on Monday going through the progress of the work. There's a very kind of visual display of the progress they're making, and I came away from that hugely encouraged that this work has got traction and there'll be a product out of it in a timely manner. The importance of the adult social care work is that this will provide the framework, if you wish, in which the PMS and hospital work can be done. So once the framework's designed, then it can be populated with that other data. The other work continues around registration improvements, intelligence-led regulation, etc. They're all in that paragraph that I think are important, but I'll not dwell on because, as I say, it's to give you, particularly non-executive directors, a sense of some progress and momentum behind this work. Following on the joint board-to-board, again, I just wanted to place on the public record that as a board we met with the NHS Digital Board, and for what I thought was a very constructive and positive meeting, and picks up on some of the issues about how we work with other people. Later in this report, and perhaps I should have thought about this in terms of just the ordering of it, at item 11, which is on page 6 of your papers, there's a brief update in relation to cyber. The Department of Health last Wednesday published their response to Dame Fiona Caldicott's report, the review of data security, consents and opt-outs, but also the report, the thematic report that we undertook on safe data, safe care. One of our recommendations in that report was about we would amend our assessment and inspection framework to include key lines of enquiry and prompts which could elicit assurance that appropriate internal and external validation against the new data security standards was indeed being carried out. This is the Information Governance Toolkit, which is being revised and will get reissued later, and something called CERT, I think, is the phraseology that's been given to this, which is an upgrade on the information governance. And the important point here is that we were not trying to provide a technical assurance that data was being secured, but this was a check that the organisation itself was assuring itself that the appropriate standards were being followed. We stand by that commitment, and indeed the work to design the hospital inspection methodology, which will begin later this year, is in place, and we'll take that forward. We also committed to training our staff so that they're aware of what they need to look for. It's a bit like Holiday Italian, is this? If you ask the way to the station, you need to understand the answer. So it's not just can you go through a checklist, you need to understand what you're being told. So this probably has implications for some of the specialist advisors we need, who might have more expertise in this than some of our inspectors. And as just going back to the board-to-board, there may well be some opportunities. Mike has had further discussion with both ministers and the Department of Health, and there might be some opportunities to do some joint work with NHS Digital on this, in addition to building this into our routine inspections. But so those discussions go on, just to give the board a sense of, again, momentum and continuity on that. Following the Glenfield Tower fire, this is at item 7 back on page 3, we were asked by the Department of Health if we could make contact with all registered providers, particularly adult social care providers, which we did. And in fact, that letter asked them to assure themselves again. We weren't asking them to send the assurance to us, but could they assure themselves that their fire safety procedures are up to date, including the issues in relation to the environment in which care was provided, to ensure that that was safe as well. And what we've attached to this report is an action plan which Max Hood, who is one of Kate's members of staff, who's been a very senior in the fire service in England, who now works with us. Max has led an action plan which is attached to this agenda, and this paragraph is just giving you an update of where we are in terms of reviewing our systems and procedures, issuing guidance notes to our staff and reviewing those. And quite properly, some inspectors who spend time away from home and might be in hotels, and hotels which are more than 4 stories high-rise, there's a natural anxiety, I think, for any of us finding ourselves in that situation. So amongst a range of things we've done is just issue some guidance to staff. Paragraphs 8 is an update on 2 legal cases, which, again, we've not put into our discussion at the board in a public session. You've been briefed on this in private session because these are current legal cases. And to some extent, Rebecca has just reminded me, the Southern Health case is still not finished. Whilst they've admitted guilt in relation to this, there's still a further hearing for sentencing. So Rebecca was advising me to be cautious about that, and I advise you to be cautious if you want to ask me questions on it as well. But the 2 issues, just to draw out here, we were challenged in relation to the application of our registration guidance, particularly about developing person-centred community services for people with learning disabilities. We've had a lot of discussion at the board about this guidance and its appropriateness. And this is based on building the right support, which came out of NHS England, the LGA and the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, which effectively said we didn't want the development of large campuses which were separate from the communities. We made a decision in relation to one application to us, and the organisation appealed. And the basis of their appeal, we were acting beyond our powers. We were actually shaping a market. The tribunal, first-tier tribunal, considered this case and handed down their written decision on the 16th. They handed down the decision on the 26th of June, and they dismissed the case, which meant that our decision not to register stands. I think one of the issues to draw out here is when the first-tier tribunal actually considered an appeal, they effectively rehear the case. And in this case, the first-tier tribunal actually visited the site of what was being registered. And they affirmed the judgment that we'd arrived at, but they added their own information in because the debate about how far connected with the community this was, they commented on. And they commented that a cul-de-sac separate from the community was not part of the community. And so I think this is interesting in terms of our future decisions about the degree of consideration that we need to apply to this. But the important point to note here, I think, is that the first-tier tribunal's judgment was that CQC had not acted beyond its powers. And therefore, I think this is a significant challenge to our judgment. And I know we go on a lot about consulting on these things, but this really does underline the importance of consultation on the guidance that we go, and just the effort and energy that goes in at board level to make sure we've got these things right and then consult on it. So I think a significant development. And again, on the 29th of June, Southern Health entered a guilty plea in relation to the prosecution that we brought in relation to the harm that had resulted. I've set out some of the detail in relation to the individual case, and of course with Robert to my left, these powers which came to CQC effective from 2015 were as a result of Robert's report, and we were using these new powers. The issue here is we weren't able to use powers before the 15 date, the April 15 date, for some of the events that have happened before. We'd got to use them for this, which is why this particular case was chosen. And as I say, I've set out some of the detail with the case and subsequent cases at that trust. And the case was heard at the Magistrates' Court, and there'll be a return to court for sentencing on the 12th of October. We had earlier in the private session of the board agreement in relation to an approach to contracting, which we took in private session because of the commercial sensitivity and the volumes and the finance arrived in this. But the purpose of that contract was to actually ensure that we can support the development of our staff, particularly in relation to the skills that are required to take enforcement action. And as a result of some work that one of our Deputy Chief Inspectors, Debbie Westhead, has led, I have to say, led with some degree of skill. We're now clear about the capabilities we would like inspectors in CQC to develop and refine, and we think one way to do this is to develop a professional requirement for the capabilities that we want to see, which is also accredited and registered by hopefully a university in relation to this, so we can actually have some capability for people to build to diploma and indeed master's levels degrees in relation to this. So that work will go through, and I want to make one correction. I think this is also in the performance report, but it did get reported in this report last month, which is, I think, Peter, you might have raised this question. We said there had been an increase in applications, registration applications, compared to last year's average. That wasn't actually true. What we've had is an increase in complex applications, and I want to correct that record through this report, but we also pick it up, I think it's the very last paragraph in the performance report. And then just to celebrate what I think is a really nice recognition of a lot of hard work that has gone on within the organisation. Last week, CQC was highly commended in the Team of the Year at the Employers Network for Equality and Inclusion Awards, where the focus on ability projecting was nominated for the work they've done responding to the 2015 staff survey results. If you remember, these staff survey results were members of our teams, individual members who have a disability, felt they were not being supported by the organisation. That led to a piece of work which has been led by HR colleagues, but also the Disability Network, and the outcome of that was a focus on ability work, which is supported by the network. Andrea is our champion, and just to reinforce the few good weeks that she's having, she was able to be there and have another success with people. But again, going back to Mary's story, where Mary has come forward to address an issue that we know we need to address, this group is supported by about 50 people who've come forward who want to make a commitment to improving how we operate as an organisation. So a nice note to end on, Peter. Thank you.
So, as you say, let's pause there before we go into the performance report. Is there anything anybody wants to raise? Paul.
Peter, thank you. David, can I just pick up on the cyber security point and the work that we're doing through inspections on looking at the assurance that trusts are getting on, not just trusts but others, are getting on the security of their systems and data. I first of all, to underline, I think you're absolutely right that the onus is on them to get the right assurance around it. I'm just a little concerned that we make sure that we, when we start to do these inspections, have the right degree of skill and knowledge and experience to make sure that we can do exactly what you said, which is to understand what they've done and the answers that come back. And I just recall that when we did the Safe Data, Safe Care piece of work, that we did go outside and use both NHS digital people and a commercial provider jointly to go around and do a lot of the work there. I think there's a need to make sure that we get the right level of skill in this first round of inspections where we're doing this, so that we can make sure that we're pitching this absolutely right, and that once we've learned about our approach, and also the first time we've done it on each individual organisation, we've got a bedrock on which we can then build going forward. So can we just make sure that we are bringing in expertise which we really don't have within the organisation here, to make sure that we're doing this thoroughly and not ticking the box?
I'll invite, if Ted's just practising, I'll invite Mike to comment. And, but I think this is why the recommendation that we made, so in a sense this came out of Safe Data, Safe Care, and we produced that report, and we said that we needed to build this into our inspections. And the second bit of it, and this picks up on your point, we also acknowledged that we needed to ensure that the people doing this, our inspectors doing this, were actually trained so they recognised it. But the reason I wanted to connect the NHS digital board review with this item, and I should have done it in the way the report was laid out, was actually the offer is there that if we do need access to technical help, we can get that without necessarily going to a commercial organisation. Now, we need to develop this and refine it, but we're not there. I'd hate to give the impression that we're there, but do you want to...
Simple answer to your question, Paul, is yes. We do need extra support on this and expertise, and we will get it. And I think we may get it from within the NHS where it exists, but we may want to look outside the NHS. And we are developing our framework for doing these inspections. There are some things that we will almost certainly do sort of at the front line, actually looking for how people leave their computers and whether there are passwords on post-it notes and things like that around the place. But there are a lot of the questions will be aimed at more senior people, whoever leads on IT and data security within a trust, but also who leads at board level, and whether it's ever been discussed at board meetings. So that we will take a similar approach to the ones that we take for other aspects of well-led, but we will clearly need expertise.
All right. Yeah, Jorah.
Just briefly, David, I know Pete's not here, he's on holiday. I think we're doing some tremendous work in the digital space right now, and Pete and his team are really doing the difficult stuff, which is the enterprise heavy lifting of registration processes, IMS3, intelligence-led. But that's very much of an enterprise inside-out view. The digital side to me is always the outside-in view, where we're really looking at things like social, to allow people to feed back to us, outside patients or relatives and friends of patients, an easy way to access into us. The other outside in, although involving our own people, would be, are there possibilities to improve the efficiency of our inspectors? Do they have to type in reports multiple times, or are there technologies out there that allow them to do it? I think, it would be worth just having a review of our digital strategy. I think we're on the right path, but I also think there's opportunities to turn us into a truly transformation digital organisation, and it'd be good just to have a review along with Pete of how we see the strategy going over the course of the next year to 3 years.
So Peter and I were speaking about this yesterday, and I think we're committed to bring a report to the board in September, and I do think that's important. I think it provides some structure and it sets some milestones and targets to go at, and I think it's right that we continue to do this work about prioritising and then ensuring those priorities have an investment and a delivery plan to support them. And some of those will get the outside-in comments because they are about how people can make comments about us. But we also then talked about let's have a workshop or a seminar where we can explore this and actually raise some of these points. I spent some time with Helen's team this week in relation to the behavioural insight team. They've done some work where they've taken our intelligence that we make publicly available, and they've actually compared that with prescribing practices and actually looked at correlation between prescribing practices and our rating of GPs, and surprise, surprise, by combining data in that way, it actually does affirm some of the things that we've been saying just using our own data sources. But I think the whole purpose of Helen coming in is to help us to do this. Her background where she's done this is combining different data sources and beginning to use these. So I think we're actively exploring those kind of issues. I don't want to give any suggestion that it's sorted and is nailed, but our ambition is, I think, to try and do that. So if the board would find it helpful to have an opportunity to explore this, I think we need Pete and Helen to do some of those things. And let's spend some time. It's clearly a priority. Our future depends on it. And as I say, I think we've made a really good start. I think you're echoing that. But there is just more to do. I think the risk for us, if I may say this, though, I think we've struggled in the past years by trying to do everything, where everything's been important and nothing's been important. And for the first time, I feel we're in a position where we have a list of priorities that goes 1, 2, 3, and we're starting at 1 and going through it. So providing that prioritisation is being done in the right way, and I think it's been very inclusive, and I know a number of you have contributed to this. I'd just like to hold a discipline about this, because actually we just need to start delivering some of these, and our staff need to see them being delivered, and I think people out there need to be delivered. Now, if as a result of the work in September we need to look at more capability and capacity, then I think we can look at that. And as the finance report later shows, we have some opportunities to do something about this without being naive about it. So I think the September debate is quite an important one, just to make sure, and your contribution to that, jury, will be hugely, hugely important, given your background and expertise. I think we're now in a position with you and Pete and Helen to add to what we've got. To begin, I don't want to lay this on individuals. This is an organisational thing, but I feel we've got the capability now to begin to do this. What we need to make sure is have we got the capacity in place to do this, and I think that's the question for September, quite frankly. So a long-winded answer, but I hope that gives you some sense.
So I think, David, what we thought was that we would have discussion with the board in September, but it would come formally to the board in October, just for the minutes. So there's a process. But I think, as David was saying, we think it's really important. We've got, by September, Pete and Helen will have been on board for some while. It's an appropriate time to just take stock and check we're going in the right direction. Good. Andrea.
Thank you. And if I could make an apology to the board and to David, which is that I should have sent through something for the report around quality matters and the launch of it last week, which goodness only knows how I managed not to do that, but I didn't. So just for the record, given that this is the first meeting that we've had after that, to report to the board that following our discussion in private session last time about the quality matters document and commitment across the whole of the adult social care sector involving providers, commissioners and other national organisations. Quality Matters was launched last week and was a very positive, inclusive event involving people who are using services, their carers and families at the heart of it, and making clear the principles that we're all adopting and the action points that we're committed to taking forward. And as colleagues know, it's aligned with the shared view of quality that we had with the National Quality Board in terms of their shared commitment to quality, and is kind of endorsed and signed up to by other organisations such as Health Watch England and the local government and Social Care Ombudsman, who are both working on a very specific first piece of action around complaints. And so I just wanted to be able to record that, and also to record thanks to everybody in the strategy and engagement teams as well as adult social care for all of the work they did to get us to where we have, and to report that the Department of Health, with the support of the Minister, has now agreed to take on the Secretariat to ensure that this work is taken forward, because that was a question that you asked me last time, was how would we know that these things would happen, and there is going to be a governance process which we will be engaged with as well.
So I thought it was a great event, the actual launch. It was really well done. But obviously, almost more important than that is the work that led to the launch was great. It was nice at the event that you were complimented on the leadership that you personally had given to getting to this point. But maybe this is an opportunity for us publicly to also thank everybody else that was part of that, because you can lead, but unless anybody's following, you don't get there. So I think it's just really, really good, and congratulations to everybody involved. Anything else on David's report before we move to the performance report? Okay, so let's move on. David, I don't know how much you want to say by way of introduction.
Not a lot. The report, sir, it's self-explanatory, so I think you've got some updates in terms of basic performance, which I think the general direction is upwards and positive, and it's not always easy, so not everything is going up all of the time, but there is progress being made. You can see the figures in terms of where we are in terms of the current underspend and what that is forecasting towards the end of the year at 5.1 million, which plays to this point about capacity. If we need it during the year, we've got an opportunity to do something. In terms of the registration data, after the addendum that I gave, you can see there's improvement taking place in registration. Safeguarding, after the changes at NCSC, I think you can now begin to see some of these figures moving back to achieve the target after changes that have taken place, and I'm personally encouraged by that and optimistic that this will be back to where it was before the review took place. We had an earlier conversation on mental health, which picked some important performance data in here. Paragraph 6, two important points here. One is that in hospitals, the frequency for re-inspection of those trusts which were rated as inadequate prior to April 17 is that they will be re-inspected by March 18. In relation to inspection frequencies for PMS and adult social care, the frequency is that which we are publishing 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. And so why is this important? Why is it flagged here? Because when we look at managing and monitoring performance over this next 12 months, it's what's included in the baseline and what we're counting from. So this is about what's in and what's out. And so effectively, TED will be accounting for 2 targets. One is the inadequates, which will be done by March 18, which is, just to make this transparent, is a slightly longer period than will be when the new frequencies are applied from April 17. And Andrea and Steve's teams are doing it in accordance with the frequencies. So I just purposely drawing this out is just to make that transparent. I don't want to gloss over it and people say, well, we weren't here when that was discussed. Mainly for you, Martin. So having said that, I'll go through. You can see the general trend that we had in the State of Care report about improvements on re-inspections begins to continue. Enforcement activity is not quite at the numeric levels that it was, but that's because the inspection is not at the numeric levels that it was that generated those. Towards the end of the report, I'm not going to go through the business planning milestones, Peter. The ambers, the amber reds, it's there, it's set out if people want to ask questions on that. And the same with internal audit. Paul, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, but you go through this in some detail at the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee. We are going to report this as a routine, and it gives the wider board the opportunity to raise this. But believe me, it has been scrutinised by Paul and colleagues at that meeting. Strategic risk register. Again, I don't intend to present in any detail. It's there itself. Evident, I hope, what the risks are is a good and accurate reflection of where we are. And then the last paragraph is really just flagging. You've got the full performance data for the first quarter, but I think finance colleagues were finishing off the financial account, so it's not quite the final first quarter report here. The next quarter report, which you'll get in November, I'm flagging in 13, and Mark's flagging in paragraph 13, the developments and the changes we will get in the presentation of this. I'm not going to present the slides. My personal view is these are much improved. I find them much easier to cast my eye over them and understand what's going on. I hope that's the case for everybody, but as I say, paragraph 13 is really about the further improvements to it. So in summary, Peter, I think first quarter of this year, I think, is showing good progress. Things that we needed to improve on, I think, are showing either strong improvements or there's some green shoots of improvements, and that which we still need to worry through. Services which have been had concerns for more than 4 quarters, I think the Chief Inspectors are digging into these, and there's some evidence in this that we're actually beginning to bottom that and understand precisely what it is that sits behind it and what actions taken to make sure we know where every single one of those is and what we're doing with it. So, and we're in a good position in relation to the money. It's a bit of an understatement, but that's we are. So that's me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Comments or questions? Yeah, Malta and then, Jora and then Paul.
I think previously it was reported that the rollout of the new sort of call centre technology in Newcastle was being bedded down, and it wasn't quite meeting the standards we would expect. Is that now at a level of maturity that we could mark it off as there's no review required on that, and we're quite happy with the technology?
I'm glad Kate's nodding, so I don't know, but Kate will.
I'll answer as best I can. Yes. No, they are hitting all their performance targets. They have a few blips as the week progresses, but generally overall they are hitting their performance targets, and the systems are much appreciated and seeing the benefits that they want to see.
Thank you, Peter. I suppose the first thing I just want to say is I do think the report here is improving. That both the commentary on it, on the slides, and the slides are going to take a little bit of time to get familiar with, but the commentary I think is good. So congratulations, I think, to Kate and to Mark and to the team on that. It's really is a big improvement. Can I just pick up on the internal audit points, because I think it might be worth saying a little bit about the audit actions that are open, because colleagues may not be able to interpret the fact that 23% are open and overdue correctly. And I wonder, Kate, do you want to say something about overdue actions there and what the significance is, and just to reassure the board on it?
We go through each of the audit actions. When we receive the audit report, we set out what it is that we're going to do, set out a timescale for that. On occasions, it can take longer than planned. The fact that they're overdue doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. It does mean that it's taken a little bit longer than we expected, but then we revise the date and make sure that we're on top of what needs to be done going forward, and then report that back. So we are looking in more detail at whether or not we set realistic expectations in the first place in terms of the dates, and also looking at things that are overdue to see how we can expedite them.
David, can I just pick up on one of the things which you referred to, which is the risk-based frequency commitments, and it really is good because there is an improving trend here, but I think it's also worth saying it's really important that we get as close to 100% on this as possible. I've talked a lot to Steve, who isn't here today, about understanding better the data in PMS, and I don't want to dwell on that now, but clearly there's a lot of work has been done, so we're clearer where there is action that we can take and should be taking, and where there are reasons why we haven't taken it. But it is something I think I'd like to come back to in the autumn, just not in PMS alone, but across the piece. If we're going to have a risk-based model, we have to be confident that where we've identified risk, we've taken the actions that are necessary. We're getting better and better at that, but we can't relax until we're really at 100%.
So the November board report, which is the next quarter, will make sure there's a full paragraph on that. There's work in hand, and we should be have that bottomed. And I absolutely get the importance of this, and I'm fully behind the work bottom of it. I don't think it'll ever be 100%. That's not to be argumentative, because there'll always be something there, but it needs to be at whatever it is, 99.5% or whatever. But that's where we need to get, I think, to absolutely your point. I think members of the public would expect us, if we've identified a risk, to know what we're doing with that risk, and I think that's just the bottom line, quite frankly, Peter. So, yes.
And I think I did say as near as possible to 100%.
Yeah.
So, but in referencing Steve, I realised that when I was giving apologies for people who weren't here, I didn't mention Steve Martin. So can we just go back, and because he definitely gave his apologies. Right. Anything else on performance or finance that anybody wants to raise? Gosh, Kate, you've got off really lightly. Brilliant. So shall we move on to the local system reviews? And do you want to get Anne and Charles? I don't know if they're out there, because we're running ahead of ourselves a little. If they're not, we'll go on to something else. While we're waiting, I agree with you, Paul. I think the slides are getting easier and easier, and clarity's there. Although because they change every month, so wait a minute.
Do one thing.
Yes.
I'm not on top of my game at all this morning. I should have also drawn out in the public report that yesterday we published the controlled drugs report. This is a requirement we've got to publish on an annual basis, a report on our oversight of controlled drugs, and the team that oversees this go about it in a very diligent way, and as a result of their work over the past 12 months, we published that report yesterday. So this is something that came out of Shipman, I think, in terms of how are these being prescribed, how is it being monitored, and we have an oversight function, which means that we have quite an extended network of people who work in different bits of the health service who have responsibility for this that we draw together. So it's available on our website for those that are interested. It's the kind of thing that's of interest to those people that work in prescribing and administering this medication rather than for the general public, because it's I found it quite a technical read in relation to it, but I think it does provide some assurance of improvements in practice in relation to the management of these medications. So apologies for missing that out.
All right, thank you, David, for that. Anne, Charles, welcome. Thank you for some pretty detailed papers you've given us, very comprehensive. So why don't I just, do we need any further introduction, looking at Andrea or David? So why don't we hand straight over to you, Anne, or Charles.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Morning, everyone, and thank you for seeing us. You'll recall at the last board meeting we said we would return to let you know the progress that we'd made with the methodology and the outcome of the test of the methodology at Harford County Council. So today I'd like to update you on the feedback we had from the council, tell you some more about the site selection and the schedule, and obviously take any questions that you have around the methodology and the audit too. Is that okay? Thank you. So since we met last, we went out to Hertfordshire and spent the day with them. And overall, there was a very positive support for the approach we were adopting in terms of the pathway, the high-impact change model, and the 3 spheres around maintaining people in their own home, crisis episode, and returning people to the usual place of residence. They gave us some very helpful observations and suggestions around the methods, which we've taken on board, and we've amended our Chloe's in accordance with the feedback, and you'll be able to see that from the paper we supplied. In addition to that, they made some really good observations around the system overview document. They felt that our original branding of a system information return implied it was about a data return rather than qualitative information. So we've taken on board their advice around the questions, we've modified them accordingly, and we've revised and rebranded as the System Overview Information Return, or SWAR as it's known now. So we've developed some stronger sub-Chloes and prompts and an assessment framework for the support of the reviewers, so we can make sure that they can get down to that detail that we need about person-centred care at the front, so we've got that assurance from the senior leadership right to frontline services. We've included the ITA statements with support from Think Local personal colleagues, because they said it was very, very important that we use them around any user-based surveys, and incorporating service users into the evidence call is very important, so we were clear we've adapted that. And we've also developed a relational audit tool, which was part of the papers we sent to you, about understanding the perceptions of a relationship within a particular system and the impact that has on delivery. We've finally been issued with the Section 48 letter, which we were delighted about because we were itching and ready to go. And we've already been in touch with Holton and set up some introductory meetings, because they're the first review will be starting, which will be on the 21st of August. The schedule for the remaining 11 is attached in the paper, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. And we have determined, so we can keep a close eye on how the methodology is developing and support the reviewers, that myself and or Alison Holborn, the Senior Responsible Officer, will be on site for at least the first 5 reviews. So the 12 sites that have been selected, if I could just refer you to those, are highlighted in the paper, and following our first site visit, well, all the site visits, we'll be producing a bespoke report for the Health and Wellbeing Board. We've developed a template for that, and we're currently trying to map the Cornwall report to that to see how it fits and works, and if it's succinct and does what we want it to do. And we'll be setting up the arrangements for the local summit post-review, so we can broker that improvement deal for the local system. And then at the end of the programme, we will, of course, be producing a national report with, which will identify our key findings and any system-required improvements.
Thank you. As I said at the introduction, a huge amount of information here, which I think is really helpful to understand what's intended. Ultimately, today we need to approve the methodology, so this is the opportunity to ask whatever anybody thinks they need in addition to what we've already been presented with before we can make that decision. If anything, if you're lucky, Jan, then we'll just say they agree. You know what I mean?
I hope so.
Any questions or comments from anybody? Paul?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, very, very helpful documents. Thank you very much. I had 2 or 3 questions. I'm sitting in Lewis's seat here, aren't I? It's catching, isn't it? The first one was really around the resources to do the work, and I noticed your comment that we got 40 names, I think it was, in relation to going out to local authority folk. And I wasn't quite sure how many we needed and how many we'd got signed up and what the gap might be between that. That was one point. And then I think I had 2 points on the resource management bit of the work, which I wasn't quite sure how that's going to, given that use of resources is such a difficult topic in hospitals. I wondered whether the use of resources bit, the resource management bit, was how well mapped out that was and how difficult that was going to be doing. And added to that, I looked at the slides and what we were asking for in terms of information through the PIRs, and there were just, I think, 3 items that we were asking for in relation to use of resource funding, I think is there, which surprised me at how limited the amount of information was we were asking for there. So I think those were probably my questions. Then the last one was actually an observation, which is, I think, with the PIRs, it would be a good idea that as soon as we can, we get them out to all all the areas we're going to. Don't wait for the sort of 6-week or before stage. Just get it out straight away, because gathering the information is going to be a bit of a task. And I think the sooner you get it out and get the system's working on that, then the better you'll be in getting that information in.
And
thank you, Paul. In terms of the size of the team that will be on site, there will be a core team of 2 reviewers, which will be internal to CQC, and 2 local government specialist professional advisors and 1 health professional advisor. Now, in terms of the SPA procurement, we've had a very, very generous offer from the LGA, and they've given us a list of 40 names of either former chief execs, current chief execs, former directors of adult social services or current directors of adult social services who have agreed to provide that expertise as part of the review team. In terms of the health professionals, we're using our existing bank of special professional advisors that we've used on the comprehensive inspection. In addition to that, we've also been in contact with the former comprehensive inspection chairs who've also expressed an interest in participation in the reviews. And we've tapped into the executive review resource with our colleagues in hospitals to make sure that we've got a good cross-representation at the right level of seniority for each review going forward.
So, I take it from that you're saying the answer is you've got plenty of resource coming forward.
I think we've got certainly enough to start, but we're still out for volunteers, particularly from commissioners, and we're working on that now with NHS commissioners to get them on board as well. But we've certainly got enough to do the first 12, yes.
With regard to the PIR and the questions about use of resources, we're doing this piece of work alongside some other piece of work that have also been done by DCLG, so they're going to be asking a number of questions about the use of resources in a local area as well. So hence we haven't asked a large amount of questions in our PIR, so we didn't want to duplicate what they were actually asking and overburden people about the questions around the use of resources. And secondly, about the actual piece about use of resources, we're actually looking at, we've turned in the methodology, we're now looking at resource governance rather than actually the use of resources. We're looking to see how they have systems and processes in place to get assurance that the resources are being used effectively.
Paul, do you want to come?
So I think my follow-up question on that would be, will we be able to compare across local authority areas on the resource management, or is this kind of just going to throw up for us examples of how it's done in different places and how people measure resource management and governance of resource management? Is it only going to look at governance, or is it going to look at actually the level of resource management? And
it'll be looking at the governance, and the actual use of the money will be looked at by DCLG. So
we shouldn't have expectations that this is going to say anything about the actual resources available in an area. Is that because I imagine quite a lot of people will think that this will say that's what this report will say.
So this is a tricky issue in relation to this. So when this was set up, the means by which local systems will get this money is a better care fund, and that's a distribution mechanism. And in the cross-government agreement about how the Chancellor's money should be taken forward, not the Chancellor, it's our money, that the Chancellor's actually allocated as part of the spring budget was taken forward. The distribution mechanism was the better care fund. And we've been asked to look at the interface between the health and care systems. The tracking of the money, if I can use that phrase, and I slightly put it into parenthesis, to be honest, the tracking of the money will be done by CLG, who are asking for a return from local authorities, because that's the distribution mechanism for the Better Care Fund grant, on how that money is being spent. So we are doing this work alongside the returns that are coming in to CLG, and of course their returns need to inform what we are doing, and I'd expect those returns to begin to inform. So I'd expect the return for the 12 places, because they're not local authorities, the 12 places that are down on this list to be informed by the tracking that CLG are doing, but they're only doing this on a quarterly basis, where I think it's a section 151, if I've got my numbers right, officer in local authorities, i.e. the director of finance, the person who's statutorily responsible, is supposed to sign a letter saying, we got this money, this is what we've done with it, and this is what we're getting from it. So I would expect what we're looking at in terms of what are your arrangements to support people who are coming out of hospital to cross-reference to some degree to the account that the Section 151 officer is going to make back to CLG in relation to that. Now, the issue here is timing. We will go on site in Holton in 21st of August. Will they have evidence of the money that they, I don't think, have yet got? The guidance didn't go out until last week. How that is working its way through and what they're doing with that. And you'll note from the press a number of local authorities are saying we can't make long-term plans because this isn't long-term money. It's given for 3 years, so how can we do it? So I think we go in, we do the job that I think Anne and Charles are setting out here, and I think if we see an asymmetry between the finance plans and the delivery plans, etc., we've got the opportunity to raise that. One of the reasons why we want people from local government, and Anne's point about people from a finance background, is for people to understand that. So the issue about seniority is important, so people can actually look at how those strategic decisions that are made at a local level, not just by local authorities, actually come together with the money. But to your point, we are not tracking the money, which is why money is referenced in the way that it is in those provider information returns. And that's the explanation, and that's, we could wish it was different, we could do it a different way, but that is what we've been asked to do, quite carefully asked to do, which is one of the reasons why this letter has taken a long time to come through, is because there's been a lot of discussion about what it is that we're being asked to do.
So, one of the things that we've heard elsewhere is that one of the problems in the social care is about the level of resource which is available from different local authorities for social care in either people in their homes or in care homes. Will this work look at the levels of support that are available financially in these places from the local authorities, and will it be drawing out whether some of those levels of support seem to be very low in comparison to other levels, or if that happens to be one of the problems that is identified?
So this goes right to the heart of this issue about it. We are not asked to comment on the quantum of money that is available to local areas to meet the needs of their populations. What this is about is what they do with the money that they've got. And remember, our State of Care report last year was all about variation. So what we've got is some people with similar amounts of resource that are performing to a pretty high level, and other areas that are performing to a low level. Going back to the selection of these 12 sites, they were selected on a dashboard of information because they were seen not to be performing to a high level. So the correlation with high levels of delayed transfers of care, and this list is there. We asked, and we are told that when the next list is released, the further 8 later in the year, which I think partly speaks to your point about just getting all of this stuff out now, etc. I think there was a judgment to do this in tranches. Not ours, this is government making these judgments. We've got the variation and we need to check that, but we wanted to look at some good places as well as places that are known to be struggling, because we think, and we continue to think this, that it's important we can describe what good looks like and what people are doing that is successful, as well as identifying what isn't working well. So I think what I'm saying, Paul, is we've been given a specific job to do within an envelope, and what you've got here is us doing that job within that envelope. There are other people going to be doing other pieces of work outside of the envelope we've been given that we need to do that work alongside them.
Andrew, did you want to add something?
Just to supplement what David said, I think the really important slide to look at in the slide deck is slide number 7, which gives you the areas which the team will focus on in terms of trying to get at the heart of what is the experience of people as they're moving through the system between health and social care, and what are the arrangements that are around that that enable them to move through that system in a way that is appropriate for them. And so I think that what the team have done really well, actually, and I do commend both Anne and Charles for, frankly, a very impressive piece of work to get to this stage of the methodology when we actually only officially got the proper letter 2 weeks ago, and we were really only asked to do it 2 or 3 months ago. So I think we will also need to reflect on the first 2 or 3 that we do to think about how we develop the methodology to make sure that if there are kind of issues in how we do this, we can improve as we go forward. But what I think this slide shows for you is what the focus is going to be, and it will draw out, so if we're talking about how do we maintain the well-being of a person in their usual place of residence, what are the packages of support around that, what's enabling that to happen, how well are health and social care working together to ensure that people are supported to maintain their well-being, and that will have some reference to what's the support that's provided from adult social care, as well as what's available from the primary medical system, medicine, and also from community health services. The kind of crisis management side of it, in terms of as people go through the hospital, we will be looking at what hospitals themselves are doing, because there's quite an awful lot of the commentary has been about delayed transfers of care being caused by the adult social care failures of provision, but actually there's an awful lot that impacts on people's flow within a hospital that hospitals themselves are managing. And we'll also be looking at the kind of final stage, which is how do we ensure that people get back to their normal place of residence, and that they're not forced into making life-changing decisions at a point of crisis of going into a care home, for example, without kind of the system actually thinking through whether that's the right thing for that individual or not. So I think that we're much more focusing on how people kind of get through the system. There will be issues that this will throw out about the appropriateness, I think, of the wraparound support that the system is giving individuals to enable them to move through the system in an appropriate way. So it's not going to be tracking the kind of pounds and pence in the way that the Department of Communities and Local Government will do in terms of the use of the money, but we will be looking at impact, which I think is the absolutely critical thing that we should be looking at.
Jane, did you want to come in?
Yes, one point's been answered, but can I just ask Charles and Anne, will there be space somewhere in this process, and I'm looking at your qualitative data analysis slide here, will there be space for people to say what a great service would look like? I mean, I understand the system, we're going to hear from poor performers and hopefully from better performers, but will there be space for people to say what a great service would look like, a great flow would look like?
In terms of the methodology, we've got already built in, it's week 3, that we'll be going out to the local areas and we'll be meeting people who use services and engaging with them in terms of their experience, both people who directly receive a service, their families and their carers. And we've also contacted a range of user-focused groups as part of our call for evidence, and we've asked them to provide a written response of their experiences in the system as well.
So we've also, while developing the methodology, we've done some work with experts by experience, and we've also worked with, I think, Local Act Personal, and developed a whole range of I statements to feed into that process as well.
I suppose my question was more about, asking them what a great service would look, what a great system would look like, rather than their experience of the current system. Because actually, people have, they're on the receiving end. They come up with some fantastic ideas.
The I statements do come from, I mean, obviously you know about I statements, but they do come from an angle saying what they'd actually want to see rather than,
Yeah, Robert. Just following up James' point, there's one part of this which is about the actual experience people have and what the experience they would expect to have in a system. But we sit here, the system sits here around happily talking about pathways, systems and bits and pieces. There was a time when members of the public had a relatively clear understanding about who provided their service, when and how, and who they should go to if they wanted information or help or whatever. The more we get into this, I suspect, the less that will be the case, and probably is now. And I wonder whether we are incorporating what we do, the degree to which the public understand what is actually happening in their area and who they now will be going to. So matters of that nature.
One of the areas we've noted in slide 7 is point 2, which is about multiple confusing points to navigate the system, and we're just seeing how local areas are working to actually try and ensure that people can navigate the system.
Well, confusion points is one thing, but I would suggest that there is also a need for not people in the system talking to themselves to understand routes and so on, but it is an overall confusion about the overall system, which of course is very difficult to communicate to people when no one in the system quite knows what it's going to be. But it is an essential part, is it not, of the process?
Yes, it is, and in a sense, what we've done in drawing out these spheres and the pressure points in slide 7 is to say where is it that we think that this actually can sometimes go wrong, and what is it that we need to test in the key lines of inquiry that the team will pursue when they are talking both in the site visits, but also asking people who are in the local area as well as those who are working in health and social care to help us determine what's actually happening. And I think the fact that we're drawing out that we can see, I mean, Health Watch talks about this all the time, lots of people do. It's nothing new that, folk don't understand how to navigate the system. They don't necessarily have the support. How does that impact on the way that people do flow in? Are they ending up in A&E because actually they have no idea where else to go? And if they did have a better idea of where else to go, they might not end up in A&E. So that's just a very simple explanation of it. But it's those sorts of issues that we would expect to be able to tease out by focusing on these points in the
we've put a number of those questions in the prompts, not only for people who use services, but also do actually staff understand what the other services are available across the system, because there's been quite a lot of research around that.
About the case tracking, because I think that might pick up on this point as well.
Yeah, as part of the methodology, we're also doing some case tracking. And we're starting the case tracking in the person's usual place of residence, rather than just at the crisis episode. So we can look exactly at how and why that person ended up in hospital and whether it was an appropriate admission or not. So we think we're starting from the right point to follow that person's journey through. And we'll be doing that as well as some dip sampling and some scenarios that we're presenting to the system as part of the methods to pick up that point as well about how people end up where they end up.
Malta and then Paul.
Anne, Charles, thank you very much for the really good discussion. Could you say a little bit more about how you're thinking about this local summit that follows the review? Because we want to encourage improvement not just by holding up the mirror but also facilitating the conversation.
We're in the process of developing some principles for the summit. But when we were first asked to do this work and we were asked to make a report, one of our considerations is where do we land this work and where does it go then? What happens to the recommendations that we make? How do we know that systems are going to take them on board and improvements are going to follow? So the discussion that Charles, Alison and I had was about bringing everybody together at a local summit to present that report, to present our findings, and work with partners to develop an improvement offer So there would be a drop-down menu almost of support for systems who were challenged, and the offer would be contingent with that system's particular circumstance, and that the local summit would be an opportunity to present the report, for the system to respond, and to start to broker that offer of support and agree how it was going to be followed up and how we were going to measure and manage improvement going forward.
When, up until now, when we've gone to look at an organisation, GPs, adult social care or hospital, we've been able to have a pretty good idea. Those organisations do have systems of governance which have some relationship with what goes on. Sometimes a very good relationship, sometimes not so very good relationship, but they have some relationship with what's going on. And it seems fair enough to ask that question of them. Here, the systems are really weak. The collective integrated systems are really weak compared to the organisations in those systems. And so to find out whether the systems will not be working, full stop, because they don't have sufficient weight and power to make these things happen. However, there will be things inside that location that are working, but that may not be generated by the system. So there might be a GP working really well with a residential home that works really well with a discharged person in a hospital, and you've got a bit of really good practice. And I think the complexity for this particular piece of work is being able to find in a system that may not be working very well bits of really good practice. And to be able to say, you know, if the system could learn from that, but in almost certainly the organisations within these systems will be not assisting the system as a whole, the integrated system, to really work in a sort of tickety-boo way. And so we're asking questions of a system which are really tough questions for a system that's very young, not very capable. But underneath that, I'd be staggered if there wasn't some really good bits of practice which the system could then universalise a bit more. So all the work I've done in locations around the country on integration, generally everywhere there's one or two or 10 or 30 good little bits. But I wouldn't say they've been generated by a system. They've been generated by a sort of human endeavour to overcome these things. Now, that's the thing we're looking at. And the thing we're looking at, if we're going to come up with something useful at the end of it, is how does the system look inside itself, find the things that are good, and then replicate it. But I think in terms of everything else we've looked at, we've got to get used to the fact that these are weak institutions as integration institutions, as against all the other institutions we've looked at.
Sorry, go on, Andrew.
Just to respond to that, Paul, because I think you're absolutely right, and one of the things that we've been working on and is included as Appendix 4 is the relational working feedback, so that we can actually really have a set of conversations that get us to the heart of how people are working together, how do they identify that good practice, and how do they share that, or how do we enable those people who may be kind of making this work despite the system, not because of the system? How do we make sure that can get shared? So I think this is quite innovative in terms of the work that we're going to be doing on this, because we've obviously not done it in quite this way before. But I think that this will be, hopefully, a really powerful way of us getting to the heart of some of what you were just talking about, in terms of understanding how people are working together in a set of governance arrangements that historically have not encouraged that in quite the way that we know needs to happen. And Anne and Charles might want to add to this, but we did some work with Debbie Sorkin, who from the Systems Leadership Centre, about how systems work together and how leaders work together on this to help inform the practice and understanding of the review teams that will be going in.
We think that the relationship audit tool and the work we've done around system leadership will do a number of things for us, really. It will introduce what we think is a common framework to start to look at how relational value works in a system and the impact that has on the quality and safety of the delivery. And I think your point about weakness, it gives you an indication of the strength of the relationship and the capacity to set up that shared endeavour and to work together as a collective rather than a set of fragmented organisations to one particular outcome. I don't think we've ever done anything like this before as part of our methodology, and I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure how it's going to work. But I think we'll be in a unique position with the audit tool to start to understand how relationships impact and what needs to happen to develop that shared endeavour across, as you say, a fragmented and quite weak system.
Paul, do you want to add anything, or are you okay in that? So, Jora and then Ted.
Yeah, this is more of a general question. So I think the work we're doing here seems quite advanced in terms of the methodology that you're developing and the data that you're going to collect and the way you're going to collect that data. I was just wondering if any of the lessons learned here could be fed into the earlier talk around the single shared view of quality. So we could just join the dots. So there seems to be some overlap, obviously not direct, and this is very specific work. But what comes out of here may be quite useful. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but I may be wrong.
So we did take the single shared view of quality into account when we developed the methodology. So the key questions throughout the methodology around the same 5 questions we'd use through the single shared view of quality. And we also took into account that that's now in the National Quality Board strategy for quality, and also it's reflected in Quality Matters, which we published last week. So we've taken that into account, and obviously this time we're going to be speaking to commissioners, which we don't normally have that interface with commissioners. We felt that we should keep those 5 questions in because anybody who's commissioning or contracting services across health and social care should be aware of those questions. So it's been taken into account. We also will be asking when we're on site how the local area does actually think about those 5 areas.
I was thinking the question, which is around the process, but maybe the data as well, because you're going to collect some rich data that they may, put into their, whatever tools and systems are going to build. So there's 2 aspects. One is the process that you talked about, and the second aspect is the data collection.
And if we collect that data, we then can feed it into the national report. Yeah.
Ted.
So can I just commend the work you put into this? I think it's really very exciting, very important bit of work. We're talking a lot about systems, and this is about systems, but the power of what comes out of these reports is going to be by reflecting the experience of individual service users. And the CLOEs are pretty well balanced between the system and the individual service users, but I suppose my plea is just that we gather enough information about individual service users to give our conclusions about the system power, because it's so easy to produce conclusions about a system that people just see as, if you like, a kind of, we've got to just do the process better, but actually this is about some individual service users who may be getting very poor services, and that needs to be reiterated in these reports.
Okay, so I think a lot of support for what you're doing is very apparent, and it really is an important piece of work. Can I just ask the board to confirm that we're happy to approve the methodology, because that's important? Lots of nods, so the answer to that is yes.
Thank you so much.
So your last excuse for not getting on with this is just gone. But can I just echo what others have said as well to both of you? I think in the short time you've had to prepare this, you've made fantastic progress, and thank you very much indeed. And so good is it, I'm going to award all of us a 5-minute stretch break to celebrate your success. And we'll just start again, if we can, please, literally in 5 minutes' time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, let's get going again if we can. Jane, unaccompanied by your Chief Executive, at least for the moment, can you just a quick update on Health Watch, please?
Of course, Chairman. And I think I'm 2 or 3 very quick points, but in general terms, I commend this report to you. I think it's wonderfully straightforward, and I feel quite proud of the work that the team are doing here and across the country. 3 very quick points to perhaps to highlight. One of the things for Health Watch is getting our name known, and the campaign "It Starts With You." So you see from the hashtag, it's to do with tweeting, and it does take us back to the basics of where we're meant to be at. So it starts with you is the individual, the person, the people we need to help them to tell us their experiences. And this one has really managed to trend. I think on the BBC at some point on there, we were number 2 story behind something on North Korea. So I think that's something. And there's even talk now of getting us onto the One Show. So I mean, I think this is sort of the appropriate sort of noise that Health Watch, that we should be generating nationally. We are getting the brand known, and that's what local Health Watch look to us for. So we even had something called a thunderclap, which enabled us to. I think everybody presses a tweet button at the same time, and we reached 1 million people all at one go. I have no idea what that means, but apparently it's a good thing. So that's our comms team, and it's it's something they have developed here, which is something that local Health Watch can really build on, and it's fantastic. Point 2. I have spent the last few weeks visiting a lot of local Health Watch, and to report back to you, they all seem to be doing good stuff, I would say it, obviously. But not just collecting evidence. They also, which I'm really impressed with, everyone I've spoken to tells me how they are seen as being a safe space in their local community for some of these really difficult conversations that need to be had. So they're a trusted and they're a safe space. I mean, they're a big player. It's very David and Goliath, but they are in at the right tables and enabling those conversations to take place, which again I think is useful. I know the NHS England likes it, and we are going to do more of that. Third point. We've just had our national conference, which was good, up in Nottingham. Thank you very much to David, because he very kindly took the time to come all the way up there and give a speech. And it's very important for local Health Watch to sit up and think, yes, we are part of this bigger national framework. For me, the interesting things from the conference, we're now working on our new strategy, and it's all about how do we nationally land the evidence that local Health Watch and people are giving us. How do we land it with even more impact? Local Health Watch are, David has said you were only 4 years old, you're an infant in some ways, but some of them have grown up very fast, and there's some really strong players out there, and it's how do we keep up with them and provide them with the services that they want. And the final point is really, what is, a lot of people quickly get into governance, but they talk about what is the contract between Health Watch and local Health Watch and other partner organisations. What is the memorandum of understanding? But it's how exactly do we relate to each other and really build on the synergies of those relationships. So that's what I'm getting so far in our work on strategy, which will end up over the summertime and will come to this board in the autumn. So. Otherwise, I'm very happy to take questions on the rest of the paper. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Who needs a chief executive, eh? So,
Oh, yours.
For good governance.
I agree with that. So, any questions or comments for Jane? Oh, sorry, Andrew, yes.
I wonder, Jane, and sorry if this is putting you on the spot, but the specific piece of work that Health Watch England is engaged with the local government and social care ombudsman, which is action number 1 on the Quality Matters action plan, about creating something that all of us who people who are using services, their carers and families can go to, so that on every website, my view or dream would be that on every website it's the same piece of A4 paper that says this is what you can expect to have happen and this is where you go. So it's all kind of coherent and coordinated. Just wondered whether there's any update on kind of the progress with that and when we might be in a position to see that kind of being rolled out.
I don't know exactly the answer to that, so I do need a chief executive after all. But I do know that everyone came away from the work and the launch with a great deal of excitement and commitment to action. So I'm sure I have heard from Imelda what is going on about it, but I think I'll find out for you what the timing is. But it's definitely in hand because it was too good a piece of work to let go.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, so seriously, I think just commend you and your team for progress that's been made. I think it's really encouraging. Thank you. So do we want then just to note that and then move on to the market oversight survey? Ted, you're doing a really great job as doorman. Thank you very much.
Stuart is hopefully on his way. That's partly one of the reasons why I asked Jane a question, was just to make sure that we gave him the opportunity to get in.
So welcome to Stuart. Thank you very much for coming. Andrew, did you want to say anything by way of introduction or just straight into Stuart?
No, just to say that to welcome Stuart, who is our Director of Market Oversight, to the board. This is the first time we brought an update to the public board meeting of our work on market oversight, which of course you and David are very familiar with because of our quarterly meetings, but we felt it would be helpful to share that with the board and to do that in public session. So Stuart will introduce the item briefly, and both of us are very happy to take questions.
Great. Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the purpose of this paper is essentially twofold. As Andrea says, to provide assurance to the board that CQC continues to fully discharge its market oversight responsibilities, and secondly, to provide some insight into feedback that the unit has recently received further to a provider survey specifically of the market oversight providers. Two areas that I sort of would highlight in the paper. The board may be aware today that the live-in and sleep-in matter that's raised in the paper has obviously sort of hit the press today. I would just emphasise that we continue to work with DH on a sort of no-names basis to sort of illuminate their thinking around the sector. And the second point was with regards to the feedback, and whilst the survey results themselves are seen as quite positive, we will nevertheless take the opportunity to learn from those and reflect on what we can do differently. So without further ado, quite happy to take questions.
So can I just, before we sort of open into questions, I mean, just say from where I sit on the governance group, which you alluded to, I just think you and your colleagues are doing a really good job. So just thank you for that. It's really reassuring. Questions? Paul?
Thank you, Peter. Stuart, I'd echo what Peter says. I think you're doing a really good job in here. That comes through in the reports you've been giving us over the year, and I think in this sort of sum-up report. Can I just go to the one of the points in the key areas for consideration and reflection, as you put it, coming out of the survey, the last one, number 3, MO's ability to identify potential market failure. What were the sort of concerns? Do we have a sense of what their concerns are around that area, and what we might do to address them?
So essentially that is going to come down to one of the exam question that we're being asked to answer, and whether that is fit for purpose and relevant for the way that today's market is operating. So we by April 2018, the unit will have been up and running for 3 years. It's our intention in the sort of 6 months running up to that to review the existing guidance, reflect on the sort of regulation and really work through what would be the optimal framework to be operating in, and then reflect on, well, what does that mean? Do we have the sort of appropriate sort of space within the perimeter fence to operate, or do we need to change that? And that's very much a piece of work that we'll be considering over the coming 6 to 9 months.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Other? Robert.
Sorry. Just a quick question about the CMA work that's going on. Have we, through your team, contributed at all to that, or do the information presumably you have, not in the public domain, I would have thought is highly relevant to the sort of things they're looking into, or are we keeping ourselves to ourselves?
We haven't been sort of sharing the content of the financial templates. We have maintained an ongoing dialogue with the CMA to shape their thinking around the type of information that we collect, so that they themselves can reach out to providers that they select and sort of obtain their own information. We continue to maintain an active dialogue with them in terms of how their thinking is evolving, whilst also updating them and making them aware of sort of market trends more generally, broader sentiment in the market, to really provide the broader insight that market oversight has.
And sorry, Peter, just to add into that, we've also had a broader set of engagement with the Competition and Markets Authority from a policy perspective. David James, our Head of Adult Social Care Policy, sits on their reference group, and I've met with them as well, because a number of the issues that they're raising are issues that come up in different ways with us through our quality inspections, as well as the work that Stuart and the team are doing from a market oversight perspective. So that there has been ongoing engagement from that point of view as well.
Okay. So I think Board were happy to note the report. Thank you again, Stuart, and thank the rest of the team for all the work that they do. It's really excellent.
Thank you very much.
Good. And if, as you're going out, you happen to see Max standing outside the door, which I think he is, you might like to ask him to come in. Thank you, Stuart. You're perfectly entitled to have assumed we'd be running late because we usually are, but for once we were ahead of ourselves, so apologies for that. But Max, welcome. Shall I just hand straight to you? No, or do you want, anybody want anything more? No, Max, straight to you.
What we have before us is the proposed health and safety strategy for CQC. This went to the executive team a few weeks ago. It's a high-level strategy, so it's sort of the next step. If you think the health and safety policy sets out what our legal requirements are, this strategy sets out at a high level how we're going to meet those legal requirements to ensure the health, safety and well-being of our staff. It's linked to HSE good practice, so you'll see the approach about plan, do, check, act is something that you'll see in a lot of health and safety executive documentation. It's part of one of the audit recommendations, so it's pretty much a sort of foundation for how we manage health and safety within CQC. Sitting behind it is a fairly detailed action plan, so it is quite broad, it is quite high level, but the action plan that sits alongside it sets out all of the actions that we've got to meet all of our requirements. A key part of it, and I think an area that we wanted to improve particularly, is about key performance indicators. So there's mention of that in here, and we're working those up, and ET agreed at the last meeting that that would form part of the quarterly performance reporting package, so that just gives everyone better visibility about how we're doing. So hopefully it's fairly straightforward and presented to you for agreement.
Thank you, and thanks for the point about the reporting back. Otherwise, there's a risk you lose sight of these things. So that's really helpful. Comments, questions from anybody? Malta and then Robert.
Max, thank you very much. Can you say a bit whether you think we'll also be able to understand the near misses alongside the actual incidents and how we learn from those?
I mean, that's a whole topic in itself, but so we're looking at replacing our current health and safety database, which is a very grandiose term for something that's not that grand, but we've got work in place. And near misses, any organisation you go to where you see a good health and safety culture, you see a high incidence of reporting of near misses, and we have virtually none. So I think that's indicative in itself. So part of it's about, and it's mentioned in here, about having a good health and safety culture, so that's just having a good awareness of health and safety, spotting hazards and actually reporting them, even if they don't end up in an accident, because it shows people are aware of it and we're managing risk before it turns into something worse.
So. It's clearly implicit and sort of probably here, but because we, the board, oversee this process and the strategy, but within this, what is the intention, strategic intention, with regard to the board's ongoing involvement in the implementation of the strategy and the need to review it from time to time, or matters of that nature? I simply ask that because the diagrams and so on have all the arrows going from the board downwards, which I can fully understand that, but there aren't many arrows coming back up. And while that's reassuring in the sense it's less for us to do, I'm not sure whether that universally reflects our responsibility and what we should do about it. But that's not to say we haven't got that responsibility when we're exercising it here today, but it's in strategic terms. How do we take that? How do we, as a board, take that forward in terms of assurance?
I mean, I think the reporting will help, so you'll have visibility of that. I think audit and corporate governance is another sort of route where we won't be down in the detail here, but you'll have that being done elsewhere and reporting back into this board. So I think just having those two things, I think it feels like health and safety is more firmly on everyone's agenda for a variety of reasons, both the audits that took place some time ago, but also more recent events. So having something that's regularly visible to the board, any
changes to the strategy we would bring back here. The action plan that supports this will be going back to audit committee for review, and there'll be a further follow-up audit as well towards the end of the year. So I think you'll, as a board, you'll feel, I hope, fairly well sighted on what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, this will come back to ACGC through the audit process, but I think there's a question about what this board should have on its agenda regularly. And I don't think we're the kind of high-risk operation that, there are other places where I've been where health and safety is number one on the agenda each month or each couple of months whenever the board meets. But nevertheless, I do think in order to generate the right culture, we need to make sure that we're doing the right things here to be seen to be doing the right things. So there's something to me about within the quarterly reporting, there should be a bit on health and safety. And that may be around sort of some key metrics, the KPIs, or it may be something else in there, I don't know. But it seems to me that it should be something which comes here on a regular basis. That was the first point. The second point I wanted to ask is, Max, if what would be the health and safety risk that would be the one which you most fear coming to pass?
Looking at what we do as an organisation, we've just done an organisational risk profiling exercise. So it's what we talked about last time, I suppose, which is probably attacks on staff, is probably the one that's most difficult to sort of prevent, but also might have the more serious consequence. We do, obviously, quite a number of our accidents are related to motor vehicle accidents, so that's another area. Our staff travel a lot for work. So those are probably the sort of ones that might result in the more significant harm, if you like. So those are the ones, as well as, I suppose, because of the nature of the places our inspectors go in, there is some sort of, potential, depending on, dependent on the prevailing safety culture of other people's organisations, not our own. So it's harder to manage. So making sure our staff understand how to look after themselves, which they're very good at, and they're experienced professionals. But it's most health and safety practice says that you should control the workplace, and that's how you control the safety of your staff. But we're effectively working in other people's workplaces most of the time, and that's where the challenge lies.
Kate, did you want to add something?
Just briefly to say that I chair the National Health, Safety and Wellbeing Committee, and probably makes sense for us to formalise that I bring the minutes from that meeting to the board in the same way as we do for ACGC and other committees. So I'll do that and highlight any specific areas of exception.
And the quarterly,
and
the quarterly performance reports and that.
Well, further question. Some boards in the outside world, sometimes described as the real world, there are specific things that the board members are encouraged to do in order to role model safety. I wondered whether we could possibly ask for a few suggestions about what we could do in that regard.
I mean, I think we might have touched on this the last time about having, other organisations. You sometimes have a board member who's got a lead reference for health and safety, which again shows the importance placed on it. But I would accept, we're not a sort of high-risk, high-incidence operation, but it does show a sort of leadership of health and safety. And I think maybe just sort of when people become aware of things, it's follow up on an individual basis and asking, and people notice things like that, as well as just sort of the responsibility on us all really to be vigilant, and if we see something we think's not right, to challenge and intervene and put it right. So it's other organisations have worked for, the phrase was always never walk past something. You know, sort of if you see something, stop, deal with it. And, you know, it's true of a number of things, not just health and safety related, but that sort of just models good behaviour that you want everyone to do.
It seems to me, Robert, that taking Max's point, that one of the big risks is what happens when our people are in other people's premises. As a board, we are pretty good at shadowing inspections and understanding the risks that people are taking in all kinds of different environments, again, going back to your point, and that's probably a very important thing to continue for lots of other reasons as well, obviously, but particularly for the safety reason. Anything else anybody wants to add? Useful debate, thank you. Thank you for the offer of the minutes. I think that's really good, and the quarterly reporting metrics, that will be good. There is a formal strategy. Are we happy to approve the strategy? Fine. Max, thank you very much indeed. Chris, I saw you slip in a few minutes ago, so let's move on to the public engagement strategy. Welcome you both. I only noticed you, Chris. Sorry, but no offence. Welcome to you both. Chris, why don't you move straight into this?
Thank you, Peter. This strategy marks the culmination of 12 months of work, working with people who use services, organisations that represent people who use services, and our staff. And it sets out an ambition and a work programme for the way in which we want to engage the public in our work, working alongside colleagues from other areas, particularly Health Watch. And also it sits alongside the restructure of the public engagement team that's been underway for the last 8 months. I'll let Holly, one of the architects of the new plan, talk through some of the key points.
Thank you. So I guess 4 of the drivers for this public engagement strategy were some known challenges that we were consistently hearing. So 1, this being that we can't do all of this ourselves, and also it might not be right for us to do so, and we should leverage the experience and what others do well. So our first objective talks to that and says that we're going to work much more in partnership with organisations that represent people who use services to basically strengthen our collective voices and help influence improvements to care. The second known challenge is that people and organisations do not always know what's happening as a result of the information they share with us. So we want to continuously encourage and enable people to share experiences of care with us, and to be able to, I suppose, use that information in a better way, and to be able to respond and tell people how we've used that and how that's led to improvement. A third area has been that people struggle to find information on our site that helps them to make choices. So we want to provide and promote public information that on a 24/7 basis helps people to do exactly that. And fourthly, we know that we need to improve the way we play back to the organisation what people think of us to drive organisational change and decisions. And we want to do that through improving the way we do public participation and use the insight that we gather. In terms of things we're going to do differently, I'll just pick out a couple. But we need to invest time and resources in developing partnerships with national and local organisations to do this well. We need to really understand who the public are and what we mean from that. They're not a homogenous group. They have lots of different needs. And if you look at the different generations of people, they engage and interact with each other differently. And that will change over the life of this strategy. So we need to be flexible and adapt to that. And thirdly, we need to support our own staff so they can play a more active role in engaging the public through better training and guidance and tools, and also use of digital engagement methods. Just to mention, this document is kind of internal policy. We're planning to create accessible versions, but also much more public-friendly content that explains what we're doing. And also, lastly, we are currently working through the detail that sits beneath this plan with the kind of in an implementation plan that will set out who is doing what and by when. So thank you.
And just to finish, the feedback that we get from this work, we will obviously make part of the quarterly report, which will come to the board. And our aim is also to do an annual review as well, so the board will get a separate insight into how this work, alongside the work of our partners, is informing how we operate as an organisation. Thank you.
No, thank you, and thank you both, and indeed others that have been involved, because in previous board meetings and in all kinds of different situations we've been talking about, well, how have we got the right public engagement, have we got information coming in, and so on. So actually having a strategy, I think, is really, really good. Any questions or comments from anybody? Oh, how surprising. Jane.
Yes, I mean, this is really useful and excellent, Chris. And thank you very much indeed. And obviously, any way we can help from Healthwatch, we're there. At our conference, I've got an offer for you. On your lovely plan on a page, you're talking about check providers do good public engagement and report on their effectiveness. And it just twiggled me. I was at our conference last week, and Healthwatch Birmingham and NHS England, NHS Midlands, are doing a lovely piece of work, quality standard, for using patient and public insight, experience and involvement to reduce health inequality. So there's a nice piece of work there. You've probably already heard of it. But so there is some good stuff out there, which is fantastic.
It's a really good model, actually, for how it can be done elsewhere. So we're talking to colleagues in NHS England about exactly that, how we can... it's good.
Great. You're getting being let... Oh, I was about to say you've been let off lightly, but you're not. Andrew's coming in.
No, I do apologise, and I apologise because I've only just spotted this one. We've been very clear in Objective 2, which is absolutely right and proper, that will enable the voices of people who use services, their families and carers to be involved. But on Objective 1, we just talk about people who use services, and we haven't included carers, families and carers organisations. So I just think if we could up front include carers in that objective, that would be very important as the message that we're sending out.
It's an important point. I'll make sure we include it.
I'm so sorry. I've
no,
not
that's fine.
spotted it before.
Me as well, so that's fine.
Okay, I think that's... Oh, Jora.
I just wondered what the metrics of success would look like. So, some people talk about engagement on a website, but sometimes engagement is because people can't find what they're looking for on a website and they're not really engaged. I wonder if you've got some online surveys, or it's very easy to do obviously through digital means. It's a lot harder to do offline. But have you got metrics of success?
So for online, part of the trick is working. So we do online surveys. Part of the trick is getting to where you want to quickly, and so we survey on that feature. We also check paths of where people go to for information, and if there are cul-de-sacs that they go to that don't give them the information that they want. So we do check and actually adjust pathways to make it easier for people to get to the information that's most appropriate. I think there are some general, as well as doing the work with online surveys, we do also do a lot of work both with Healthwatch and with other colleagues as well to assess how people perceive us, because there's a lot of this is about trust. As a public engagement strategy is a function of the information we have, but also the trust in people for that information. And so we assess monthly and quarterly people's reaction to some of the information that we put out there, and how easy they find it to provide information to us. So I think a combination of those things are what we'll bring back at the quarterly report, but also at the annual review, so we get a sense of both how we're doing, in a sense, tactically around how we provide the right information, but also how we're ensuring as an organisation that we're creating the right environment for people to share information with us.
Agreed. I think I don't know if there's an opportunity to work with the digital team, because most people don't want to go on websites. They just want to query. They want to go on a search box. And I don't know if there's opportunities for us to create sort of metadata. I don't know if you're working with Pete and the team to create that sort of search capability.
David hates talking about about taxonomy, so I decided I wasn't going to do it today. But that metadata is another word for taxonomy. That's one and the same thing. So we're exactly working on that with our colleagues from the digital team to make sure that the information we collect we can find again, and that we allow people to do one search that gets them to the information that they want to go. It is a dull and an important, but it's a really important point. What we collect and the way we collect that information determines how easy it is to find it again. The other thing we're trying to do in a digital space is that we shouldn't be the only place where people go. So if they go elsewhere, so we'll be talking to the local government ombudsman about how people go into the system to complain and how we share information with other organisations. So if they come to us but actually also want to complain, how we can seamlessly transfer the information to the LGO so that they get the experience, the people who are giving us information get the experience they want as well. And I think being available in many different places where information is powered by what CQC is saying is actually an important place for us to get to.
Good. So thank you. Are we all happy to approve the strategy? Great. Thank you very much, both of you. Really, really good. Excellent. So before we don't get calm down. We haven't got to that point yet. So before we get to that point, have we got any other business for the board from the board members? Jane.
I'm sorry, Chairman, don't look so shocked. I missed my punchline. My team this morning, when I was talking to them about our It Starts With You campaign, I thought, what have we actually achieved? And they said it's increased, I don't know if this counts now, listen to Jora, increased our website traffic by 90%, and the Find Your Local Health Watch page went up by 106%. So I don't want to let them down. We have made some differences.
Right, and you can introduce them to Jora, who can say why, actually. So I've got one other bit of business, which is just to say, Sir Mike, finally, this is your last meeting. We've said goodbye and good wishes on a number of occasions, but we can't end the board without saying a huge thank you on behalf of very many people for your career originally as a clinician. Obviously, huge contribution to cancer, but as far as this board is concerned, your enormous contribution is really hard to overstate the contribution you've made to CQC, to the whole hospital inspection process. And if Lewis were here, he would be saying the safety and quality of what happens in our hospitals. And I just, on behalf of everybody, just want to say thank you very much and to wish you every success in many endeavours, which I'm sure you will be moving on to in the months ahead. So just everybody, thank you, Mike, very much indeed. Right, so lots of people put their hands up, but in fact, lots of people put their hands up. But Mr. Ward actually is the only one who had notified in advance that he wanted to say something. So I will give him the first shot. If you like to sit there and introduce yourself and say whatever it is you're going to say.
Thank you, Mr. Moyman. My name is Andrew Ward. I've had a background in public protection for over 40 years. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'll be as quick as I can. When I last addressed the board in February this year, I welcomed the CQC's focus on better use of intelligence, and I said, patients, families and staff are your best intelligence sources. You need to nurture them, encourage them, be kind to them, understand them, and demonstrate you always act in patients' interests first by your actions. Since February, a number of events have occurred. I'll briefly mention just four. One of these has already been touched on. One, a former chief executive of St George's, who was deemed by the Care Quality Commission to be a fit and proper person, despite complaints from former NHS staff to the contrary, received a suspended prison sentence, having pleaded guilty to fraud. The second event, an NHS Foundation Trust, and you've mentioned this, Southern Health pleaded guilty to an offence of failing to provide safe care and treatment in, I understand, and I understand the reasons why, the first ever prosecution of a trust brought by the Care Quality Commission. Thirdly, Eileen Chubb, a campaigner in the care sector, alleged on national television, and I quote Eileen directly, we have 47 cases where whistleblowers' identities had been given to their employer by CQC inspectors, a horrendous betrayal of trust. And fourth and lastly, a commercial for-profit information organisation, Wilmington plc, held a 2-day National Patient Safety Conference, which was attended by many NHS executives and senior members of this board. And a lot of people attended that, although I do note the Secretary of State for Health suddenly decided, for his own reasons, not to appear in person. So it appears to me that there's some listening happening and a little action. And the question I ask myself is, are the CQC's responses to that listening timely, appropriate and lawful? And taking the 4 examples I spoke of, on fit and proper persons, if you are constrained by the law, and I think, Mr. Wyman, you suggested that to me in February, and I apologise if I've got this wrong, that you are constrained by the law, then my question is, well, then why don't you seek to change it? All your actions in this area appear to be far too little and too late. On prosecutions, you have said, and in my view, it's a carefully chosen example with Southern Health, but just as Sir Robert has warned that there might be more mid-staffs in future, I assert that there are already more Southern Healths now. So who next is my question. On whistleblowers, you already have clear legal guidelines set out to you by the Information Commissioner's Office on lawful and unlawful disclosure of whistleblowers' personal information in the Memorandum of Understanding dated April 2015, which is published on your website. So some hypothetical questions. Can you assert that you have not breached the law in respect of all whistleblowers with whom you have had contact? Even if you lawfully defend every decision to disclose the identity of whistleblowers, is that ethically responsible? Is your engagement strategy at odds with effective regulatory compliance monitoring? And the point I'm making there is, should you listen less to providers and act faster on whistleblower concerns? And lastly, on patient safety, think about who you are not listening to at patient safety events. For example, those who have the microphone taken from them or switched off, and I know of one example, I know there are others, while speaking. Those who cannot attend because they were not invited, or they cannot afford the cost, and unlike you, whose attendance at these events is funded by taxpayers, or because, like Will Powell, a member of HSIB Expert Advisor Group, they're excluded for expressing the views that don't conform to common purpose on, for example, duty of candour and safe space. So those are just things that I'd like you as a board to think about. I'm not expecting answers today. Thank you very much for listening.
So a lot of points in there. I think it's interesting that you're raising them today. You've sat through the whole of the board meeting, which started with a whole session on freedom to speak up, which I think is indicative of our real interest in this whole area. And it ended with a public engagement discussion, which again is absolutely part of this. So I think the general proposition, do we really want to be intelligence-led, to go back to the last discussion you and I had, and are we really trying to get those views from members of the public and also from members of staff? The answer is absolutely yes. Specifics, fit and proper, I've already said to you that the regulation is the regulation, and we are both consulting on how we use the regulation and whether there should be some changes to the regulation. So we're aware of that. Prosecutions, we're using our prosecution power more. It's a matter of judgment as to when it's used, and also obviously it's a matter of having both the situation and the evidence where prosecution is appropriate. Ms. Chubb may well say that there are a large number of situations where we have disclosed unlawfully identity of a whistleblower. All I can say is that of the specific situations that have been brought to my attention in those cases, we did not disclose unlawfully a whistleblower's identity, and clearly that is not something that we would ever knowingly contemplate doing. And then finally, I'm afraid I don't know what the conferences you're talking about, and I wasn't there, but engagement in its wider sense with people is something we do a lot of, and in many different formal and informal settings, because it's a really important part of what we do. So I'm not sure if that answers in detail all your questions, and I suspect we'd have a very long board meeting if we were to go into those in detail, but the generality, I hope, is covered by what I've just said. And I'm conscious that there are other people who want to come in. You want to say something very, very briefly in response, and then San, nice to see you back, you're next.
Two things very briefly. First of all, on a good point, Health Watch Berkshire have highlighted in their recent published report, I can't remember which page it's on, but they've given a half a page. They're very concerned about the treatment of whistleblowers in their area. So, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know whether the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian can do some case reviews on what went wrong there. Maybe you want to have a look at that. But Health Watch Berkshire have highlighted in their report concerns about treatment of whistleblowers in their area. Secondly, the two board members that attended, my understanding is, were Sir David B. and Sir Robert Francis. It was the Patient Safety for All conference, which took place on the 4th and 5th of July. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. San, and then we'll go to David after that, and if there's time, we'll go on there. But briefly, if you can, San. But nice to see you back. We've missed you.
Blonde moment. Good morning, Board. Thank you very much for letting me speak. Just to say, with backup for David, or Andrew rather, the unlawful disclosure of my reporting did happen. So I was unlawfully disclosed to the people that I had reported on by the CQC. So I'm definitely one of those people. What I wanted to ask, I wanted to report one thing. I'm going to do it in public now because it's a lot easier and safer. I've had quite a serious report from transgender group in Devon, and the Devon Partnership, or the trust there, are refusing their clients, advocates and or chaperones in consultations. So to the point that another member of the transgender community had threatened to cut themselves off, self-mutilate themselves, but they are refusing them advocates and chaperones in consultations, which is really, really, really serious for them. So if that could have a look at for Devon, that'd be great. Just one thing about Martin, for you, when you put down, I know this, you probably don't see it in the same way, but you have NGO, obviously, which is the National Guardian's Office, but an NGO is a non-governmental organisation. So can you put NG for National Guardian rather than NGO, because it makes it look like it's a different body altogether, which is a bit confusing. My main question, you'll be glad to know, I'll be over now, is there any requirement on boards, and I don't mean the CQC board, I mean trust boards, to do, I know you've done it, the unconscious bias training? When you do an inspection, do you ask them, have they done unconscious bias training? Or do you suggest it to them?
Okay, so just on your first point, more detail, not now, and of course we'll look at it. On the absolute final word from Sir Mike, he's poised to push the button. Go for it.
On the unconscious bias training, I've just checked with Ted as well. We don't think we do that specifically. We ask, as you can imagine, a whole range of different questions, but can we take that one away? Think about it.
We went to West London Mental Health Trust Board, and they're taking up the triangle of care, which is obviously important for them. But from the actions of the board, I would think that unconscious bias training would be a remarkably good idea for them. Treating carers or others in a less than human way is not good practice for the people that you are paid to care for and look after. So their actions, they don't seem to have learned any lessons from their issue a number of years ago. The acting in good faith I certainly think that maybe putting the unconscious bias training as an option or putting it somewhere within the inspection, because if the board have that kind of bias and they are the leadership for one of the biggest trusts in the country, then the staff are already under vast pressure. There's shortages, as reported in all your CQC inspections. But if that kind of leadership in that state is coming from the board, it doesn't bode well for the staff and certainly not for the patients and the carers.
Okay, thank you. So the points have been taken on board. Yeah. So that's
have a good summer. Thank you.
That's great. David and then Robin, and then that will be, I think, the end.
David Hogarth, Neighbour Care, St John's Wood and Maida Vale. Last time I talked to you a little bit about some research I did into the evidence underlying criticisms by adult social care of about kindness, based on the KLOE about kindness and compassion, and I noted that the evidence was almost always observation, and that you were very, very good at seeing what was going on, as far as you could see what was going on. I extended this a little bit since the last meeting to look at adverse judgments about respect for privacy and dignity, of which there were many more. I looked, there were about 36 altogether. There was one particular home that especially stood out in this, and it stood out because it alone was the only one that had actually installed CCTV. They had 16 cameras in only in the communal areas. In the sort of explanation of the why a required improvement rating had been given, they said they weren't sure about how kind and caring the place was, because on the one hand they'd observed some kind and caring interactions, but on the other hand they'd talked to a relative who was a bit equivocal and said, well, I suppose it was all right, but it wasn't anything special. And that's how they left it. No, you could take it or leave it. And I would have thought that, given that there was the CCTV there, they might have gone back and looked at some of the footage, which I'm assuming it had been kept, and seen to see whether, which was true, whether the kindness and compassion which was being shown was simply for the basis of the inspection, or whether in fact it was an ongoing thing. But they didn't do that. Instead, they seemed to be quite hostile to the CCTV altogether, and all they were concerned about was the consent and was there an invasion of privacy. And that brought back to me my own experience last year when I put in an acoustic device which I think showed that somebody was not being turned as often as he should be when he had pressure sores, not as often as NICE would say he ought to have been. But when I took this to the CQC, they did not look, or they did not listen to the recording at all. And it also reminds me of a case in Yorkshire where somebody had put in a covered camera, and again the CQC would not, the inspectors locally would not look at the footage that she had collected, at least not initially. And I suppose what I really want to say is, it seems to me that if you have got evidence of this kind, then the CQC should be looking at this evidence. And I wonder if there could be an assurance that when such evidence exists, it will be looked at in future, and you will not just think about issues like consent and privacy, but also say, look, I have some extra evidence which can resolve some of the unresolved questions that have come up during our inspection.
So thank you, David. The last time you raised this, which I think was at the last meeting, but it may have been the one before, David gave you an answer that said we were going to be reviewing the guidance that we give on the use of surveillance, which, as you rightly say, is both audio and video. And I think as part of that review, we need to think about how we use it as well. So I don't think, Andrew, unless you want to say anything different, I want to give an absolute commitment today as to what we're going to do, but absolute commitment, we will think about what you've just said as part of our further thinking on this. The whole world has moved on a long way in 3 years.
Can I come back just briefly?
Yep.
It could happen before the guidance come out.
What could happen?
Looking at evidence, looking at what evidence there is.
Well, I just think we need to think really carefully about how we do it, and I give you the undertaking we're going to think really carefully about how we do it, but I'm going to go beyond that at this stage. And then, yeah, Robin, lastly.
Thank you, Chairman. Robin Pike from the Health Watch Hertfordshire. I'm aware this has been a very long board meeting. A question about the inspection process going forward. As I was very taken by something said at the very beginning of the board meeting about listening. And a question briefly on health and safety. Is there any intention in the developing inspection process perhaps to give a little less emphasis to data and patient surveys, with which I think many patients have become rather weary, and perhaps a little more emphasis given to listening to patients in the course of inspections and also via health watch, local health watches. The other aspect of the inspection process going forward, is there any plan to perhaps more formalise within the academy the assessment of prospective inspectors in their ability to write succinct inspection reports in a certain time allocation, in the sense of a more examination-based approach as is used by the Royal Colleges?
So on your first question, you were suggesting it as an alternative. You have to do less of one to do more of the other, and I don't think I agree with that. I think it's really important we get intelligence through data and through surveys and through every mechanism we can. It's also very important that we engage with service users and their families and with staff as we go about things, and we will be doing that. So I think it's more of both, not more of one to have less of the other. And on the second point about report writing, again, you've been at a number of board meetings. This is something which we have a number of mechanisms underway at the moment to both improve the accessibility of our reports and also to improve the timeliness of publishing the reports. And there are a number of different things that we haven't trained to do that. And hopefully the evidence that they are successful will become apparent in the coming months. So, but thank you for the general thought. And with that, I think we need to end the meeting, but just thank all of you who both raised questions and others that have been here today from the public, and thank the board again, and we'll see you in September. Thank you.